Picture this. You're 32 years old, working double shifts as a janitor at a corporate office building, and you've just been told by the VA that your disability claim has been denied again. You're struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment. Your chronic back pain from an IED explosion keeps you awake at night, and you feel completely invisible to a world that thanked you for your service, but forgot you existed the moment you came home. Then you make one simple mistake. You knock on the wrong door. But what if I told you that wrong door would change everything? What if that moment of vulnerability, that single tear rolling down your cheek from frustration and exhaustion, would catch the attention of a tech billionaire worth hundreds of millions? What if your biggest moment of defeat was actually your greatest opportunity, wearing a disguise? Have you ever wondered how many life-changing moments we miss because we're convinced we don't deserve them? How many doors do we walk past because we've been told we're not smart enough, not polished enough, not worthy enough to even try the handle? This is the story of Marcus Rodriguez, a former Marine sergeant who discovered that sometimes the universe has a strange way of putting us exactly where we need to be, even when we're absolutely certain we're lost beyond hope. But here's the question that will stay with you long after this story ends. If someone looked you in the eye right now and asked, "What's really breaking your heart?" would you have the courage to tell them the truth? Would you risk being seen at your most vulnerable moment? Or would you put on that mask we all wear and say everything's fine when it's falling apart? Marcus had perfected the art of that mask. 3 tours in Afghanistan, including one where he'd saved 4 fellow Marines from a burning vehicle after an IED attack that left him with chronic pain and invisible scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. He'd come home to a country that waved flags on Veterans Day and forgot about veterans the other 364 days of the year. He'd been promised job placement assistance that turned into generic resume workshops. He'd been told his military experience was valuable while being rejected from position after position because he didn't have the right college degree or the right civilian experience. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd managed million-dollar equipment overseas, led teams through life-or-death situations, and coordinated complex logistics under pressure that would break most people. But apparently, none of that qualified him to manage a retail store or coordinate projects in an office setting. The civilian world had a different language, different rules, and Marcus felt like he was trying to navigate without a map. If you're ready to discover how one moment of honest vulnerability can transform not just a single life, but ripple out, to change an entire industry's approach to hiring veterans, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because Marcus's journey will remind you that your struggles don't define your limits. They define your strength. And sometimes the person who's meant to see that strength is waiting behind the door you never planned to knock on. The story I'm about to tell you happened in Seattle, in one of those gleaming tech buildings that seem to touch the clouds. It's a story about how a wrong turn in a hallway became a right turn in a life. It's about how sometimes our greatest defeats are actually setups for our greatest victories. And it's about why the most powerful question anyone can ask isn't, "What can you do for me?" but "What's really going on with you?" Marcus had been working the graveyard shift at Nexus Tower for 8 months when everything changed. Nexus Tower housed dozens of tech companies, startups, and corporate offices. It was the kind of building where 20-something millionaires walked past 50-something janitors without ever making eye contact, where people talked about changing the world while the people who actually kept their world clean remained completely invisible. He'd taken the job because it was the only thing available after his latest round of job rejections. The night shift paid slightly better, and it meant he could avoid most of the daytime employees who looked through him like he was part of the furniture. Marcus preferred it that way. Less interaction meant fewer opportunities to be reminded that he was seen as just the help, not as someone who'd once been trusted with decisions that affected human lives. But working nights had its own challenges. The building felt different in the dark hours, quieter but somehow more intense. Emergency lights cast long shadows down empty hallways. The hum of computers and ventilation systems created a constant background noise that could either be soothing or maddening, depending on your state of mind. And Marcus's state of mind had been deteriorating for weeks. The VA denial letter had arrived on a Tuesday. After 18 months of paperwork, medical evaluations, and bureaucratic runarounds, they'd concluded that his chronic back pain and sleep disorders weren't sufficiently connected to his military service to warrant disability compensation. Never mind that he had medical records documenting the IED explosion. Never mind that 3 fellow Marines had written statements confirming the incident and its aftermath. The VA had decided that Marcus was essentially lying about the connection between his military service and his current health problems. The letter was clinical, cold, filled with regulation numbers and procedural language that turned his pain into a series of checkboxes that hadn't been properly marked. It felt like being told that his service hadn't mattered, that his sacrifice had been insignificant, that his current struggles were somehow his own fault for not being tough enough to just get over it. Marcus had read that letter sitting in his car in the VA parking lot, watching other veterans walk in and out of the building with the same defeated expression he felt settling over his own face. He'd folded the letter carefully, put it in his pocket, and driven to work that night without saying a word to anyone about what had happened. Who would he tell anyway? His family back in Texas meant well, but they'd never really understood what he'd been through overseas or what he was going through now. His few remaining friends from the military were dealing with their own struggles, and he didn't want to add his problems to their load. The rejection hurt in ways that went beyond the financial implications, though those were significant enough. Without disability compensation, Marcus was barely scraping by on his janitor's salary. His studio apartment in a rough part of Seattle cost most of his paycheck, leaving little for anything beyond basic survival. He'd been hoping the VA compensation would give him enough breathing room to maybe take some classes, learn new skills, figure out a path forward that didn't involve pushing a mop cart through empty hallways for the rest of his life. But more than the money, the denial felt like society's final verdict on his worth. He'd given the best years of his life to military service, had been willing to die for his country, had actually saved lives under fire. And now that same country was telling him through official letterhead that his problems weren't real enough to deserve help. The worst part was the growing certainty that maybe they were right. Maybe he was just making excuses. Maybe other veterans had faced worse and figured out how to adapt without complaining. Maybe he was weak for struggling with things that shouldn't be that difficult. Maybe he deserved to be invisible, pushing a cart through hallways, while other people built careers and lives that mattered. These thoughts had been circling through Marcus's mind for days when he made the mistake that would change everything. It was a Thursday morning, technically Friday since he worked nights, and he was finishing his rounds on the upper floors of Nexus Tower. The building had 43 floors, and Marcus was responsible for floors 38 through 43. The top floors housed the most successful companies, the ones with the biggest contracts and the fanciest offices. Floor 43 was special. It only had 2 office suites, both occupied by major players in the Seattle tech scene. Suite 4301 belonged to a venture capital firm that Marcus had learned to clean quickly and quietly. The partners often worked late and didn't appreciate being interrupted by janitorial staff. Suite 4302 was different. It was the headquarters of a company called Stellar Dynamics, founded by a guy named Alex Chen, who'd apparently built some kind of revolutionary software platform that Marcus didn't pretend to understand. Marcus had only seen Chen a few times, usually leaving the building as Marcus was arriving for his shift. He seemed younger than Marcus, despite being incredibly successful, maybe early 30s, always carrying a laptop bag and moving with the kind of focused energy that successful people seem to possess naturally. Chen had never spoken to Marcus directly, but unlike many of the building's tenants, he'd occasionally nodded acknowledgement when their paths crossed. It wasn't much, but in Marcus's world, even small gestures of recognition felt significant. That Thursday morning, Marcus was running behind schedule. He'd spent extra time cleaning up a mess on floor 39, where someone had apparently spilled coffee all over a conference room carpet. His back was aching more than usual, a combination of the physical work and the stress he'd been carrying since the VA letter. He was tired, frustrated, and not paying close attention to details that normally mattered. He was supposed to clean suite 4301 first, then move to 4302, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying conversations with VA representatives, imagining different ways he could have explained his situation, wondering if there was any point in appealing the decision. He was thinking about the growing pile of bills on his kitchen table, and the notice from his landlord about a rent increase that would take effect next month. So when Marcus knocked on the door of suite 4302 instead of 4301, he wasn't really present in the moment. He was somewhere else entirely, lost in a spiral of self-doubt and financial anxiety that had become his constant companion. The knock was soft, automatic, the kind of polite announcement cleaning staff make to ensure they're not interrupting anything important before using their master key to enter, but this time, someone answered the door. Alex Chen had been awake for 36 hours straight when he heard the soft knock on his office door. He'd been wrestling with a coding problem that had stumped his entire development team for weeks, the kind of technical challenge that could either make or break his company's next product launch. Empty energy drink cans littered his desk, and his eyes burned from staring at multiple monitors displaying endless lines of code that refused to cooperate. Stellar Dynamics was at a critical juncture. The company had grown from Alex's dorm room startup to a $50 million operation in just 4 years, but their next software release would determine whether they became a major player in the industry, or just another cautionary tale about rapid growth without sustainable innovation. The pressure was immense, not just from investors and employees, but from Alex's own relentless drive to prove that a kid who'd grown up in his grandmother's restaurant could compete with Silicon Valley's elite. Alex had immigrated from Taiwan with his family when he was 12, speaking broken English and struggling to fit into American schools where his accent made him a target for bullying. His parents had worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat, his mother cleaning houses during the day and working at a textile factory at night, his father driving a delivery truck and helping his grandmother run a small restaurant that barely broke even. They'd sacrificed everything so Alex and his younger sister could have opportunities they'd never had. The weight of that sacrifice had driven Alex through sleepless nights in college, through the early days of building his company when he'd lived on ramen noodles and slept on his office couch. He'd succeeded beyond his family's wildest dreams, but success had brought its own isolation. The higher he climbed in the tech world, the further he felt from the working-class values that had shaped him. He lived in a world now where people threw around millions like pocket change, where the biggest problem most of his peers faced was deciding which luxury car to buy next. Sometimes Alex missed the simplicity of his childhood, when his biggest worry was whether he'd have enough quarters for the arcade after helping at his grandmother's restaurant. Back then, hard work had immediate, visible results. You cleaned tables, and they were clean. You helped a customer, and they smiled and said thank you. The feedback was direct, human, meaningful in ways that coding algorithms and managing investor expectations would never be. That night, Alex had been thinking about his grandmother, who'd passed away 6 months earlier. She'd never really understood what Alex did for a living, but she'd been proud of his success in the way that only grandmothers can be, bragging to anyone who would listen about her grandson who worked with computers and made lots of money. What she'd really been proud of, Alex realized now, wasn't the money or the recognition. She'd been proud that he'd found a way to help people, even if she didn't understand exactly how software could change lives. The knock on his door was so soft that Alex almost missed it over the hum of his computer fans. He'd been expecting his assistant, Janet, who sometimes came in early to prepare for important meetings. But when he opened the door, instead of Janet's familiar face, he found a man in a janitor's uniform standing in the hallway, looking confused and slightly embarrassed. Marcus was older than most of the building's employees, probably early 30s, with the kind of posture that spoke of military training even in civilian clothes. His uniform was clean and pressed, and he carried himself with a dignity that seemed at odds with the uncertainty in his eyes. There was something about his presence that reminded Alex of his father, the way working-class men carried themselves when they took pride in their work, regardless of how others perceived it. But what struck Alex most was the expression on Marcus's face. It wasn't just confusion about being at the wrong door. There was a depth of exhaustion there, an emotional weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. Alex recognized it because he'd seen it in his own reflection during the darkest moments of building his company, when failure seemed inevitable and success felt impossible. Marcus started to apologize immediately, explaining that he'd meant to go to the other suite, that he was sorry for disturbing Alex so early. His voice was steady but quiet, the kind of controlled tone that suggested he was used to making himself small, to minimizing his presence so as not to inconvenience others. Alex could hear the Texas accent underneath the careful professionalism, and something about the combination of military bearing and regional warmth reminded him of customers at his grandmother's restaurant who'd always been polite and respectful, even when times were tough. Most people in Alex's position would have simply directed Marcus to the correct office and closed the door. Alex had important work to do, deadlines to meet, problems to solve that affected millions of dollars and dozens of employees. But something about Marcus's demeanor stopped him from taking the easy route. Maybe it was the memory of his grandmother, who'd always had time for people others overlooked. Maybe it was his own exhaustion making him more emotionally open than usual. Or maybe it was simply recognition of something familiar in Marcus's eyes. Instead of redirecting him, Alex found himself really looking at Marcus, noticing details that most people would miss. The way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, suggesting an old injury that still caused discomfort. The careful way he positioned his cleaning cart, with everything organized precisely, speaking to someone who'd been trained to maintain order under pressure. The fact that despite his obvious embarrassment at the mistake, he maintained eye contact and spoke clearly, indicating respect for himself and others that transcended job titles. But most importantly, Alex noticed that Marcus's eyes were slightly red, not from tiredness, but from emotions he was trying hard to suppress. There was a brightness there that suggested recent tears, the kind of controlled anguish that came from trying to hold yourself together when everything felt like it was falling apart. Alex's grandmother had taught him that you could learn everything you needed to know about someone's character by watching how they handled unexpected moments. Did they blame others for their mistakes? Did they make excuses or take responsibility? Did they treat service workers with respect or contempt? Marcus was handling this unexpected encounter with grace, despite his obvious emotional distress, and that told Alex volumes about who he was as a person. The question came out before Alex had consciously decided to ask it. "Are you okay?" It wasn't the polite, automatic inquiry that people usually made. It was a genuine question, asked with the kind of attention that demanded an honest answer. Alex had stepped back from his doorway, creating space for a real conversation rather than a quick dismissal. Marcus's reaction was immediate and telling. His controlled composure slipped for just a moment, revealing surprise that someone had noticed his emotional state, followed quickly by a reflexive attempt to minimize and deflect. He assured Alex that everything was fine, that he was just tired from the night shift, that he didn't want to take up any more of Alex's valuable time. But Alex had spent years learning to read people, first as a survival mechanism in school when he needed to avoid bullies, later as an entrepreneur when he needed to assess potential partners and investors. He could see that Marcus wasn't fine, and more importantly, he could see that Marcus was someone who rarely admitted when he wasn't fine. There was a strength in that kind of self-reliance, but also a loneliness that Alex understood from his own experience of carrying burdens alone. The building around them was mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional security guard making rounds and the soft sounds of mechanical systems keeping everything running. The hallway felt like a neutral space, removed from the usual hierarchies and expectations that governed interactions between CEOs and janitors. In this quiet bubble, Alex felt like he could ask the kind of question that really mattered. "I've been working all night," Alex said, gesturing toward his office where multiple monitors still glowed with unfinished code. "Sometimes when I'm up this late, I start thinking about things that are bothering me instead of focusing on work. Is that what's happening with you?" It was a gentle way of acknowledging that Marcus might be dealing with something beyond simple tiredness, while also sharing enough of his own vulnerability to make it safe for Marcus to be honest. Alex had learned this technique from his grandmother, who'd had a gift for getting people to open up by first showing that she understood their struggles. Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between his instinct to maintain professional boundaries and the obvious relief of having someone actually ask about his well-being. Alex could see him weighing whether it was appropriate to share personal information with a building tenant, whether this unexpected kindness was genuine or just polite curiosity that would disappear once he revealed the messy reality of his situation. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and the weight of two very different lives intersecting in an unexpected moment. Alex found himself hoping that Marcus would trust him with whatever was causing that look of controlled desperation, not because Alex had any immediate solutions to offer, but because he recognized the isolation that came with carrying heavy burdens alone. Marcus finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I got some bad news from the VA recently," he said. "It's been on my mind, making it hard to concentrate on work. I'm sorry if that's affecting my job performance." The apology struck Alex as both heartbreaking and telling. Here was someone dealing with what was obviously a significant personal crisis, and his primary concern was whether it might inconvenience others. It spoke to a level of personal responsibility and consideration for others that Alex rarely encountered in his professional world, where people routinely blamed external factors for their problems and expected others to accommodate their needs. Alex knew enough about veterans' issues to understand that VA problems were rarely simple matters. His company had participated in job fairs specifically aimed at hiring veterans, and he'd heard stories about the bureaucratic nightmares that many service members faced when trying to access benefits they'd earned through their service. He also knew that many veterans struggled with the transition to civilian life, often facing unemployment or underemployment despite possessing skills and experience that should have made them valuable employees. But beyond the general knowledge, Alex could see in Marcus's face that this wasn't just a bureaucratic inconvenience. This was something that went to the core of his sense of self-worth and place in the world. The controlled way he spoke about it suggested someone who'd been trained not to complain, not to burden others with personal problems, to handle difficulties with quiet dignity, even when that dignity came at the cost of getting the help he needed. Alex found himself remembering conversations with his father about the customers at their family restaurant who'd clearly been struggling financially, but had always maintained their pride and dignity. His father had taught him to recognize the signs of people who were working hard but barely getting by, who needed help but would never ask for it directly. Marcus had that same quality, the same combination of strength and vulnerability that came from facing real hardship while refusing to let it define your character. The early morning light was beginning to filter through the building's windows, casting long shadows down the hallway and highlighting the exhaustion on both men's faces. Alex realized that this unexpected encounter had already lasted longer than most of his meetings with important clients, and yet it felt like the most meaningful conversation he'd had in months. There was something about Marcus's presence that reminded Alex why he'd started his company in the first place. Not for the money or recognition, but because technology could solve real problems for real people. Standing in that hallway, looking at someone who'd served his country and was now struggling to find his place in civilian society, Alex felt a clarity of purpose that had been missing from his recent late-night coding sessions. The conversation that followed changed both of their lives, though neither man could have predicted it at the time. Alex invited Marcus into his office, a gesture that violated several unspoken rules about boundaries between executives and building service staff. But at 5:30 in the morning, with most of Seattle still asleep, normal rules felt less important than basic human connection. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, clearly uncomfortable with crossing into a space that wasn't meant for people like him. The office was impressive without being ostentatious, filled with the kind of understated luxury that came from success rather than inherited wealth. Multiple monitors displayed complex code, whiteboards covered with diagrams and equations, and bookshelves lined with technical manuals and business strategy guides. But what struck Marcus most was how lived in the space felt, how it reflected someone who actually worked rather than just managed. Alex gestured toward a comfortable chair near his desk, then moved to a small kitchen area to make coffee. The simple act of hospitality felt revolutionary in Marcus's experience with the building's tenants. Most people in Alex's position treated service staff as background noise, acknowledging them only when something needed to be fixed or cleaned. The fact that Alex was making coffee for both of them, treating Marcus as a guest rather than an interruption, suggested a level of respect that Marcus hadn't experienced in months. While Alex prepared the coffee, Marcus found himself studying the office more carefully. The walls displayed framed photographs that told a story of immigrant determination and family success. Pictures of what looked like a small restaurant, probably Alex's family business. Photos of graduation ceremonies, Alex in academic regalia, standing next to proud parents who looked like they'd worked hard their entire lives. Awards and recognition certificates mixed with personal mementos that spoke to someone who remembered where he came from. One photograph in particular caught Marcus's attention. It showed a much younger Alex, standing with an elderly Asian woman in what appeared to be the kitchen of a restaurant. Both were covered in flour, laughing at some shared joke, and there was an intimacy to the moment that spoke of deep family bonds. The woman had the kind of face that suggested wisdom earned through hardship, the same expression Marcus had seen on his own grandmother's face when she talked about surviving the Depression. Alex returned with 2 mugs of coffee, noticing Marcus's attention to the photographs. "That's my grandmother," he said, following Marcus's gaze to the kitchen photo. "She taught me everything important I know about treating people with dignity, regardless of their job title or social status. She used to say that you could judge someone's character by how they treated the people who cleaned their tables." The comment hung in the air between them, not accusatory but deeply meaningful. Marcus understood that Alex was explaining why this conversation was happening, why a successful CEO was taking time to talk with a janitor instead of focusing on the work that demanded his attention. It wasn't charity or condescension. It was recognition of shared humanity based on values that transcended professional hierarchies. Marcus sipped his coffee, surprised by how good it was. Not the burnt bitter brew he was used to from break-room vending machines, but something carefully chosen and expertly prepared. Even this small detail reinforced the sense that Alex approached everything in his life with attention and care. Whether it was building software or making coffee for an unexpected guest. "The VA thing," Marcus said finally, deciding that Alex's openness deserved honesty in return. "I applied for disability compensation 18 months ago. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Got injured saving some Marines from an IED explosion. Chronic back pain, sleep disorders, the usual stuff that comes with blast injuries. They just denied my claim, said there wasn't sufficient evidence connecting my current problems to my military service." Alex listened without interrupting, maintaining the kind of focused attention that Marcus rarely experienced. Most people, when they heard about veterans' issues, either thanked him for his service in a way that felt automatic and meaningless, or launched into political opinions about military spending and foreign policy. Alex did neither. He simply listened, treating Marcus's experience as important enough to deserve his full attention. "The rejection letter was brutal," Marcus continued. "All this clinical language, basically saying I was lying about the connection between getting blown up and having back problems now. Like they think I'm trying to scam the system for benefits I don't deserve. And maybe they're right. Maybe other people have been through worse and figured out how to deal with it without complaining." Alex set down his coffee mug and leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something? When you were overseas leading other Marines, did you ever doubt their word when they reported problems or requested support?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd been expecting sympathy or advice, not a question that made him think about his own leadership experience. "No," he said after a moment. "If one of my Marines said they had a problem, I took it seriously. Their well-being was my responsibility." "So why are you applying a different standard to yourself?" Alex asked gently. "Why are you more willing to trust a bureaucratic system's assessment of your condition than your own experience of living in your body every day?" The question hit Marcus with unexpected force. He'd spent months internalizing the VA's rejection, allowing their denial, to become confirmation of doubts he'd been carrying about his own worth. But Alex was right. Marcus would never have dismissed one of his Marines' reports of injury or illness. He would have fought for them, advocated for them, insisted they receive the care they'd earned through their service. "I guess I've gotten used to being invisible," Marcus said. "In the military, I had a role, a purpose, people depending on me. Out here, I'm just another veteran who couldn't figure out how to make it in the civilian world. The janitorial work pays the bills, but it's not exactly what I imagined doing with my life when I was leading convoy security missions in Kandahar." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "What did you imagine doing? Before the military? After the military? What were your plans?" Marcus hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had asked him about his aspirations, rather than just his immediate needs, that he almost didn't know how to answer. "I was good with logistics," he said finally. "Supply chain management, coordinating complex operations, making sure everything happened on time and on budget. I thought maybe I could translate those skills into civilian project management or operations work. But every job application gets rejected because I don't have the right college degree or the right civilian experience." "Tell me about a logistics challenge you solved overseas," Alex said. "Something specific that required creativity and problem-solving." Marcus thought for a moment, surprised by the genuine interest in Alex's voice. There was a forward operating base in Afghanistan that was having supply issues. They were constantly running short of critical supplies while being overstocked with things they didn't need. The problem was that supply requests were going through multiple layers of bureaucracy, and by the time they reached the distribution centers, the information was outdated or distorted. As Marcus described the problem, his voice gained confidence and energy. He explained how he'd developed a new communication system that bypassed some of the bureaucratic layers, created real-time inventory tracking using improvised technology, and established direct relationships between the base commanders and supply personnel. The solution had improved efficiency by 40% and had been adopted by other bases in the region. Alex listened with growing fascination. The problem Marcus had solved was essentially a complex logistics and communication challenge, the kind of issue that tech companies paid consultants millions of dollars to address. Marcus had identified systemic inefficiencies, designed innovative solutions, and implemented them successfully in a high-stakes environment where failure could literally mean life or death. "That's incredible," Alex said when Marcus finished. "You essentially designed and implemented a supply chain optimization system under combat conditions. Do you realize how valuable that kind of experience is in the civilian world?" Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It was just common sense. You see a problem, you figure out how to fix it. That's what Marines do." "No," Alex said, firmly. "That's what exceptional problem solvers do. Most people see a complex system and accept its limitations. You saw a broken system and rebuilt it. That's exactly the kind of thinking that drives innovation in every industry." The conversation was interrupted by Alex's phone, buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it briefly, then looked back at Marcus. "My assistant is going to be here soon to prepare for some early meetings, but I don't want this conversation to end here. Would you be willing to meet again? Maybe grab lunch later this week?" Marcus was stunned by the invitation. CEOs didn't have lunch with janitors. There were social rules, professional boundaries, expectations that kept people in their designated roles. But Alex seemed genuinely interested in continuing their conversation, treating Marcus as someone worth getting to know rather than just a problem to be solved or a charitable cause to be supported. "I don't want to take up your time," Marcus said automatically. "You've got important work to do, and I should get back to my cleaning rounds." "Marcus," Alex said, using his name for the first time. "I've been working on the same coding problem for 3 days, trying to optimize a system that's supposed to improve efficiency for supply chain management. You just described solving a similar problem in a much more challenging environment with far fewer resources. Your perspective might be exactly what I need." The idea that Marcus's experience might be valuable to Alex's work was almost incomprehensible. Marcus had grown so accustomed to his military experience being seen as irrelevant to civilian employment that he'd stopped thinking of it as an asset. But Alex was looking at him with the kind of focused attention that suggested he saw potential where others saw only limitations. "I finish my shift at 6, Marcus said tentatively. "If you really think it would be helpful, I could meet you somewhere." Alex smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from him during their conversation. "There's a diner about 6 blocks from here called Murphy's. Nothing fancy, but they make good coffee and they're open early. Would 7 work for you?" As Marcus prepared to leave, gathering his cleaning supplies and straightening his uniform, Alex walked him to the door. "Thank you," Alex said, "for trusting me with your story and for helping me remember why I got into this business in the first place. Sometimes we get so focused on complex technical solutions that we forget the human problems we're trying to solve." Marcus left Alex's office feeling something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense that his experience mattered, that his struggles weren't just personal failures, but systemic problems that could be addressed. The conversation had lasted less than an hour, but it had shifted something fundamental in how he thought about his place in the world. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of routine tasks performed with unusual energy. Marcus found himself thinking about the logistics problems he'd solved overseas, remembering the satisfaction of creating order from chaos, of making systems work better for the people who depended on them. For the first time since his VA denial, he felt like those experiences might be valuable assets rather than irrelevant history. But as he walked home through the quiet Seattle streets, Marcus also felt the weight of uncertainty. Meeting Alex had been an unexpected gift, but it didn't change the fundamental realities of his situation. He still had bills to pay, rent increases to worry about, and a future that felt uncertain and precarious. One conversation with a successful CEO, no matter how meaningful, couldn't solve the structural problems that kept veterans like him trapped in cycles of underemployment and financial instability. Still, there was something different about how Marcus carried himself as he walked home that morning. His shoulders were straighter, his pace more confident. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to something beyond just getting through another day. Whether the lunch meeting with Alex would lead anywhere meaningful remained to be seen, but the simple act of being heard, of having his experience treated as valuable, had restored something in Marcus that he'd thought was permanently broken. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the city as Seattle began another day. Marcus thought about the thousands of veterans scattered across the country, working jobs that didn't reflect their capabilities, struggling with systems that seemed designed to exclude rather than include them. His conversation with Alex had been personal and specific, but it had also highlighted broader questions about how society valued different kinds of experience and expertise. As he reached his apartment building, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his situation. The VA's rejection still stung, and his financial struggles remained real and pressing. But Alex's questions had helped him see that the problem wasn't his lack of worth or capability. The problem was a system that failed to recognize and utilize the skills that veterans brought from their military service. That recognition didn't solve his immediate problems, but it changed how he thought about potential solutions. Instead of seeing himself as someone who'd failed to adapt to civilian expectations, he could begin to see himself as someone with valuable experience that civilian systems hadn't figured out how to properly utilize. It was a subtle but profound shift in perspective, one that opened up possibilities he hadn't been able to imagine just hours earlier. The call came at 3 in the afternoon, just as Marcus was getting ready for another night shift. He'd been thinking about his upcoming lunch with Alex, rehearsing what he might say about his military experience, and wondering whether he was making too much of what might have been just a moment of polite curiosity from a busy executive. The phone number on his screen wasn't familiar, but the professional tone of the woman's voice was unmistakably corporate. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Sandra Mitchell from Nexus Tower Building Management. I need to speak with you about an incident that occurred during your shift last night. Can you come in for a meeting this afternoon?" Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd been careful during his shift, hadn't broken anything or missed any cleaning responsibilities. The only unusual thing had been his conversation with Alex Chen, but that had been brief and professional. Still, he could hear something in Sandra's tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine performance review. "Of course," Marcus said. "What time would be convenient?" "As soon as possible. I'll be in my office until 5. The 20-minute bus ride to Nexus Tower felt like the longest trip of Marcus's life. He ran through every detail of the previous night's shift, trying to identify what might have triggered a management meeting. His work had been thorough and completed on schedule. He'd been respectful to the few employees he'd encountered. The conversation with Alex had been initiated by Alex himself, not something Marcus had pursued inappropriately. But Marcus had enough experience with institutional hierarchies to know that explanations didn't always matter when someone in authority had already decided there was a problem. The military had taught him that perception often mattered more than reality, especially when it came to interactions between people at different levels of the command structure. Sandra Mitchell's office was on the 15th floor in the building management suite that Marcus had cleaned dozens of times but never visited in an official capacity. The waiting area was designed to impress, with expensive furniture and abstract art that spoke to the building's prestige. Marcus sat in one of the leather chairs, feeling acutely aware of his civilian clothes and wondering whether he should have worn something more formal for what was clearly going to be a serious conversation. When Sandra finally called him into her office, Marcus was surprised by her appearance. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of polished professionalism that came from years of managing complex building operations. Her office was organized with military precision, everything in its designated place, suggesting someone who valued order and efficiency. "Mr. Rodriguez," she began, consulting a file on her desk. "I received a complaint this morning about your conduct during last night's shift, specifically about an unauthorized interaction with one of our premium tenants." Marcus felt his heart sink. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it stated directly still felt like a physical blow. "I can explain what happened," he started, but Sandra held up a hand to stop him. "According to the complaint, you knocked on the wrong door, entered a tenant's office without permission, and engaged in personal conversation that was inappropriate for building service staff. The tenant felt uncomfortable with your behavior and wanted it reported to management." The description was technically accurate, but completely missed the context of what had actually happened. Marcus struggled to understand how his conversation with Alex could have been characterized as inappropriate or unauthorized. Alex had invited him in, had initiated the personal questions, had been the one to suggest they meet again. "Mum, I think there might be some misunderstanding," Marcus said carefully. "I did knock on the wrong door by mistake, but Mr. Chen invited me in to talk. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my background, and he was the one who suggested we meet for lunch to continue the conversation." Sandra's expression didn't change. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand that you might have misinterpreted Mr. Chen's politeness as genuine interest. However, executive tenants often feel obligated to be courteous, even when they're uncomfortable with inappropriate behavior from building staff. The fact that you believed the interaction went well doesn't mean it was appropriate." Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a system where his perspective didn't matter, where the narrative had already been established regardless of what had actually happened. It was the same feeling he'd experienced with the VA, being told that his own experience of events was less reliable than institutional interpretations of those events. "The complaint came through our tenant relations department," Sandra continued. "Apparently, Mr. Chen felt that your emotional state during the encounter was concerning, and he was worried that you might be dealing with personal issues that could affect your job performance. He wanted us to be aware of the situation in case you needed additional support or supervision." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Alex hadn't seen their conversation as meaningful connection between equals. He'd seen it as a concerning encounter with an emotionally unstable employee who needed management intervention. Marcus felt the humiliation burn through him, realizing how naive he'd been to think that someone like Alex could see him as anything other than a potential problem to be managed. "Given the nature of this complaint and your current assignment to our premium floors," Sandra said, "I'm going to have to reassign you to different duties. Effective immediately, you'll be working the parking garage levels and mechanical areas. This will minimize your contact with building tenants while still allowing you to maintain your employment." The reassignment was a professional death sentence disguised as administrative efficiency. The parking garage and mechanical areas were where building management sent employees they wanted to forget about. the least visible and least desirable positions in the janitorial hierarchy. It was work that required no skill and offered no advancement opportunities, the kind of assignment that made clear you were seen as a liability rather than an asset. Marcus wanted to argue, to explain what had really happened, to defend himself against charges that felt fundamentally unfair. But he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. Sandra had already made her decision based on whatever complaint had been filed, and nothing Marcus said would change her interpretation of events. "I understand," Marcus said finally. "When do I start the new assignment?" "Tonight. Report to Jim Patterson in the basement mechanical room at your usual time. He'll explain your new responsibilities." As Marcus left Sandra's office, he felt the weight of familiar disappointment settling over him like a heavy coat. Once again, he'd allowed himself to hope that things might be different, that someone might see his value beyond his current circumstances. Once again, he'd been reminded that people like him weren't meant to have conversations with people like Alex Chen. The bus ride home gave Marcus time to process what had happened and try to understand how he'd misread the situation so completely. Maybe Alex had been polite but uncomfortable. Maybe his questions had been motivated by concern about Marcus's mental state rather than genuine interest in his experience. Maybe Marcus had projected his own desperate need for recognition onto a situation that was actually quite different from what he'd imagined. By the time Marcus reached his apartment, he'd talked himself into accepting Sandra's version of events. It made more sense than his original interpretation. Successful executives didn't have meaningful conversations with janitors. They didn't see military logistics experience as valuable civilian expertise. They didn't invite building service staff to lunch as equals. Marcus had let his guard down, had allowed himself to be vulnerable with someone who'd seen that vulnerability as a red flag rather than a sign of authentic humanity. The conversation that had felt like recognition and respect had actually been Alex managing a potentially problematic employee while gathering information to report to building management. The lunch invitation, which Marcus had seen as genuine interest, now seemed like something Alex had offered in the moment and then regretted later. Maybe Alex had realized that encouraging a janitor's aspirations was inappropriate, or maybe he'd simply been polite in a situation he'd found uncomfortable. Marcus spent the afternoon in his apartment, staring at the walls and trying to rebuild the emotional barriers that had protected him before his conversation with Alex. It was safer to expect nothing, to keep his head down and his aspirations realistic. The military had taught him to adapt to circumstances beyond his control, and this was just another situation that required adaptation rather than resistance. When evening came, Marcus reported to the basement mechanical room to meet Jim Patterson, the supervisor for the building's lowest-tier maintenance positions. Jim was a gruff man in his 50s who'd clearly been working blue-collar jobs his entire life. He looked at Marcus with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many employees come and go to invest much energy in getting to know new workers. "You're the guy from upstairs," Jim said without preamble. "Sandra said you had some kind of incident with a tenant. Down here, we don't have tenant contact, so that won't be a problem. Your job is to keep the parking garage clean, maintain the mechanical rooms, and handle any maintenance requests that come down from the upper floors." The work was exactly what Marcus had expected: physically demanding, repetitive, and completely isolated from the building's professional environment. The parking garage was a concrete cave that smelled of exhaust fumes and dampness. The mechanical rooms were loud, hot, and filled with equipment that required constant attention but no particular skill to maintain. Marcus threw himself into the work with grim determination, using physical labor as a way to avoid thinking about what had happened. The routine was mindless but exhausting, which suited his current mental state perfectly. He didn't want to think about Alex Chen or the conversation that had seemed so meaningful just hours earlier. But even in the isolation of the basement levels, Marcus couldn't completely escape reminders of what he'd lost. Occasionally, he'd catch glimpses of the building's professional world through security monitors or overheard conversations between security guards. The contrast between that world and his current environment felt like a constant reminder of the distance between his current reality and his abandoned aspirations. 3 days into his new assignment, Marcus was cleaning the parking garage when he noticed a familiar figure walking toward the elevators. Alex Chen was leaving the building earlier than usual, carrying his laptop bag and moving with the same focused energy Marcus remembered from their encounter. For a moment, Marcus considered whether he should acknowledge Alex's presence, maybe even thank him for his earlier kindness, despite how things had turned out. But as Alex approached, Marcus realized that Alex was looking right through him, showing no sign of recognition or acknowledgement. It was as if their conversation had never happened, as if Marcus had returned to his previous state of complete invisibility. Alex passed within 10 feet of Marcus without any indication that he remembered their interaction or cared about what had happened as a result of his complaint. The moment crystallized everything Marcus had been trying to accept about his situation. He was invisible to people like Alex, noticed only when he made mistakes or created problems. The conversation that had felt so meaningful to Marcus had clearly been forgettable for Alex. Just another minor incident in a busy executive's complicated life. Marcus finished his shift that night with a new sense of clarity about his place in the world. He was a janitor, not a logistics expert or a potential consultant or anything beyond what his uniform represented. His military experience was irrelevant history, not valuable civilian expertise. His aspirations were fantasies that only caused disappointment when he took them seriously. The basement assignment wasn't punishment, Marcus realized. It was protection. Down here, he couldn't make the mistake of thinking he belonged anywhere else. Down here, he couldn't forget his place in the building's hierarchy. Down here, he was safe from the kind of hope that led to humiliation and professional consequences. As Marcus walked home through the empty Seattle streets, he felt the weight of a decision settling over him. He could continue working in the basement, collecting his paycheck and keeping his head down until he figured out some other plan. Or he could look for different work entirely, maybe something that didn't involve serving people who would never see him as fully human. Either way, he was done pretending that his military experience made him special, or that people like Alex Chen could see past his current circumstances to recognize potential that clearly didn't exist. The conversation had been a moment of weakness, a break in the emotional discipline that had gotten him through 3 combat tours and 8 months of invisible labor in a building full of people who lived in a completely different world. Marcus had learned his lesson. Some doors were meant to stay closed, and some conversations were meant to remain superficial. The safety of invisibility was better than the pain of recognition that turned out to be misrecognition, kindness that turned out to be management, and hope that turned out to be delusion. What Marcus didn't know was that Alex Chen had never filed any complaint. In fact, Alex had spent the 3 days since their conversation trying to figure out how to help Marcus without overstepping professional boundaries or creating awkward situations that might make Marcus's work life more difficult. Alex had been looking forward to their lunch meeting and had already started thinking about ways his company might benefit from Marcus's logistics expertise. The complaint had come from an entirely different source, though it had been carefully crafted to appear as if it originated from Alex's office. The real architect of Marcus's reassignment was David Thornton, the senior partner at the venture capital firm in Suite 4301, the office Marcus had originally been assigned to clean that morning. David had arrived early for a breakfast meeting, with potential investors and had been surprised to find Suite 4302's door open, with voices coming from inside. Corporate espionage was a constant concern in the competitive tech industry, and David's first instinct was to investigate what appeared to be an unauthorized after-hours meeting in a competitor's office, assignment that made clear you were seen as a liability rather than an asset. Marcus wanted to argue, to explain what had really happened, to defend himself against charges that felt fundamentally unfair. But he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. Sandra had already made her decision based on whatever complaint had been filed, and nothing Marcus said would change her interpretation of events. What he'd witnessed through the partially open door was Alex Chen having an animated conversation with a janitor, discussing supply chain logistics and military experience. To David's calculating mind, this looked like Alex was either conducting unauthorized background checks on building staff, or worse, potentially recruiting talent through unconventional channels that might give Stellar Dynamics an unfair advantage. David had built his career on identifying and exploiting opportunities that others missed. He'd made millions by recognizing undervalued assets and positioning himself to benefit from their eventual success. If Alex Chen was secretly recruiting military veterans with logistics expertise, David wanted to understand the strategy and potentially disrupt it before it could benefit a company he viewed as competition. But David was also smart enough to know that direct interference would be difficult to justify. Instead, he'd crafted a complaint that would accomplish his goals while appearing to be motivated by legitimate building management concerns. He'd called Sandra Mitchell and expressed worry that one of the janitorial staff seemed to be having personal problems that were affecting his professional behavior. David had carefully avoided claiming direct harassment or inappropriate conduct, which would have required specific evidence. Instead, he'd suggested that the janitor appeared emotionally unstable and had been seeking inappropriate personal conversations with building tenants. He'd mentioned seeing the employee in tears and expressing concern about the potential for escalating behavior if the situation wasn't addressed. The beauty of David's complaint was that it appeared to be motivated by genuine concern for both the employee and building security. Sandra Mitchell had no reason to question the report or investigate further, especially when it came from a premium tenant whose venture capital firm generated significant rental income for the building. David had also been careful to make the complaint appear as if it came from multiple sources, mentioning conversations with other tenants who'd expressed similar concerns. The implication was that Marcus's behavior had been noticed by several building occupants, making immediate action necessary to prevent further incidents. Sandra had accepted the complaint at face value and taken swift action to address what appeared to be a legitimate personnel issue. She'd reassigned Marcus to minimize tenant contact while preserving his employment, a solution that seemed both humane and professionally appropriate. Meanwhile, Alex had been completely unaware that any complaint had been filed. He'd been busy with his coding project and investor meetings, looking forward to his lunch with Marcus and genuinely curious about how military logistics experience might inform civilian business operations. Alex had seen Marcus several times in the building since their conversation, but hadn't approached him, respecting what he assumed were Marcus's work responsibilities and not wanting to create awkward situations during business hours. When Marcus didn't show up for their scheduled lunch meeting, Alex had initially assumed that Marcus had gotten cold feet or decided the meeting wasn't worth his time. Alex had waited at Murphy's diner for an hour, checking his phone and wondering if he'd somehow misunderstood the arrangement or communicated the wrong time or location. After Marcus failed to appear, Alex had felt disappointed, but not particularly surprised. He'd been in enough situations where class and professional differences made genuine connection difficult to understand that Marcus might have felt uncomfortable with the arrangement. Alex had planned to find Marcus during his next late-night work session and suggest a more casual conversation, maybe just stopping by to check how things were going. It wasn't until Alex tried to find Marcus on the upper floors 3 days later that he learned about the reassignment. Janet, his assistant, had mentioned in passing that the usual janitorial staff had been changed, with someone new covering the executive floors. When Alex asked about the previous janitor, Janet had checked with building management and reported back that the employee had been moved to different duties for unspecified personnel reasons. Alex's first instinct was to contact building management directly and ask about Marcus's situation, but his legal counsel had advised against getting involved in employee personnel matters, especially when Alex didn't have complete information about what had happened or why the reassignment had been made. Still, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the situation. Marcus had seemed genuinely interested in their conversation and had specifically confirmed the lunch meeting before leaving Alex's office. It didn't make sense that someone would arrange a meeting and then simply not show up without explanation, especially someone with Marcus's military background and apparent sense of personal responsibility. Alex decided to do some discreet investigation on his own. He started paying attention to the building's janitorial schedules, trying to figure out when and where Marcus might be working in his new assignment. He also began asking careful questions about building personnel policies and procedures for handling employee issues. What Alex discovered was that personnel decisions at Nexus Tower were typically made quickly and with minimal documentation, especially for service staff positions. Sandra Mitchell had broad discretionary authority to reassign employees based on tenant complaints or operational needs, and such decisions were rarely reviewed or appealed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Alex also learned that tenant complaints, even informal ones, carried significant weight in personnel decisions. Building management prioritized tenant satisfaction above almost all other considerations, which meant that any expression of concern from a premium tenant would likely result in immediate action to address the perceived problem. The more Alex learned about the system, the more convinced he became that Marcus's reassignment was the result of some kind of misunderstanding or miscommunication. He couldn't believe that anyone who'd witnessed their conversation would have interpreted it as inappropriate or concerning, which meant that either someone had deliberately misrepresented what happened, or the complaint had come from a different source entirely. Alex's investigation eventually led him to David Thornton. Through careful questioning of building security staff, Alex learned that David had been in the building early on the morning of Alex's conversation with Marcus and had made inquiries about building security protocols shortly afterward. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Confronting David directly would have been problematic for several reasons. Alex couldn't prove that David had filed a false complaint, and accusing a fellow tenant of deliberate interference would have created exactly the kind of building management issue that Alex was trying to avoid. Moreover, any direct conflict with David could have made Marcus's situation worse rather than better. Instead, Alex decided to focus on finding a way to help Marcus. That wouldn't depend on reversing the building management decision or proving that the original complaint was baseless. If Marcus was stuck in a basement assignment because of David's interference, Alex would find a way to offer Marcus better opportunities outside the building entirely. The challenge was making contact with Marcus without creating additional problems, or putting Marcus in an awkward position with his supervisors. Alex couldn't simply show up in the parking garage and start a conversation without raising questions about his motives and potentially triggering additional complaints. Alex's solution was characteristically thoughtful and strategic. He arranged to have his car serviced at unusual hours, giving him legitimate reasons to be in the parking garage during Marcus's shifts. He also started working late more frequently, ensuring that he'd be in the building during times when Marcus might be visible. When Alex finally encountered Marcus in the parking garage, he was struck by how much the situation had changed Marcus's demeanor. The man who'd been willing to open up about his military experience and personal struggles now avoided eye contact and maintained the kind of professional distance that suggested he wanted to minimize interaction. Alex's attempt to greet Marcus and ask how things were going was met with polite but distant responses. Marcus clearly had no interest in revisiting their previous conversation or explaining what had happened in the intervening days. He seemed focused entirely on completing his work tasks and avoiding any behavior that might be seen as inappropriate or unprofessional. The encounter left Alex frustrated and concerned. He could see that Marcus had retreated behind the same emotional barriers that had been in place before their original conversation. But now those barriers seemed reinforced by additional hurt and disappointment. Whatever had happened to cause Marcus's reassignment had also convinced him that their previous interaction had been a mistake he shouldn't repeat. Alex realized that any direct attempt to help Marcus would likely be rejected or misinterpreted. Marcus clearly believed that their original conversation had somehow contributed to his current problems, which meant he would be suspicious of any additional overtures from Alex. The trust that had made their first conversation possible had been damaged, possibly irreparably, but Alex couldn't simply forget about Marcus or pretend that their conversation hadn't mattered. The insights Marcus had shared about logistics and problem-solving were still valuable, and Alex remained convinced that Marcus's military experience represented exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that could benefit civilian organizations. More importantly, Alex had been raised with values that didn't allow him to ignore unfair treatment when he had the power to address it. His grandmother had taught him that privilege came with responsibility, that success meant using your advantages to help others rather than simply accumulating more advantages for yourself. Alex began developing a plan that would allow him to help Marcus without requiring direct contact or putting Marcus in a position where he might face additional professional consequences. The plan was ambitious and would require significant resources and careful execution, but Alex was confident that it could work if he approached it strategically. The first step was to create opportunities for veterans like Marcus outside the traditional hiring system that seemed designed to exclude rather than include military experience. Alex had already been thinking about veteran hiring as a business strategy, but his conversation with Marcus had convinced him that the issue required more than just standard corporate diversity initiatives. Alex started researching veteran employment issues more thoroughly, reading studies about the challenges that service members faced in transitioning to civilian careers. What he found confirmed his suspicions that the problem wasn't lack of talent or capability among veterans, but rather systemic issues in how civilian employers evaluated and utilized military experience. The more Alex learned, the more convinced he became that addressing veteran employment wasn't just a social responsibility, but also a business opportunity. Companies that figured out how to effectively recruit and integrate military talent would have access to a pool of experienced professionals that their competitors were largely ignoring. Alex began reaching out to other business leaders in Seattle, testing their interest in collaborative approaches to veteran hiring. He was surprised by how many executives expressed frustration with traditional recruiting methods and were open to exploring alternative approaches to identifying talent. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The conversations convinced Alex that there was genuine appetite for innovative hiring initiatives, especially if they could be structured as business opportunities, rather than charitable obligations. The key was demonstrating that veteran hiring could provide measurable benefits to participating companies, rather than simply serving social goals. As Alex developed his plan, he kept thinking about Marcus working in the parking garage, using skills that had saved lives overseas to clean concrete floors and maintain mechanical equipment. It was a waste of human potential that reflected broader problems in how society valued different kinds of experience and expertise. Alex was determined to create a system that would recognize and utilize the capabilities that people like Marcus possessed, even if those capabilities didn't fit traditional civilian career paths. The plan would take months to implement and would require careful coordination with multiple organizations, but Alex believed it could fundamentally change how veterans were perceived and employed in the civilian workforce. Most importantly, the plan would create opportunities for Marcus specifically, though Alex intended to structure it in a way that wouldn't single Marcus out or create the appearance of special treatment. If Alex could build a legitimate pathway for veteran employment, Marcus would benefit along with hundreds of other service members who deserved better than their current circumstances. Marcus's days in the basement of Nexus Tower settled into a numbing routine that perfectly matched his emotional state. He arrived each night at 11 p.m., descended to the parking garage levels, and spent 8 hours in a concrete world that felt like a physical manifestation of his invisible status in society. The work was mindless but physically demanding, sweeping oil stains from parking spaces, emptying trash bins, maintaining the massive ventilation systems that kept the underground levels habitable. The isolation was complete. Hours would pass without Marcus seeing another human being, just the occasional security guard making rounds or late-working executives retrieving their cars. The mechanical rooms hummed with equipment that required constant attention, but no particular expertise, a perfect metaphor for how Marcus felt about his entire civilian existence. 3 weeks into his new assignment, Marcus had almost convinced himself that this was where he belonged. The basement was honest in its limitations. No one expected anything from him beyond basic maintenance tasks. No one asked about his background or aspirations. No one offered false hope or pretended that his military experience had civilian value. But the isolation also gave Marcus too much time to think, and his thoughts inevitably circled back to the conversation with Alex Chen and the mysterious complaint that had derailed what he'd briefly imagined might be a turning point in his life. Marcus had replayed the conversation dozens of times, trying to identify what he'd said or done that could have been interpreted as inappropriate or concerning. The more he analyzed the encounter, the less sense it made. Alex had been the one to invite him in, to ask personal questions, to suggest they meet again. Marcus had been respectful throughout, had answered questions honestly but without oversharing, had left when it was clear the conversation was ending. Nothing about their interaction felt like it warranted a management complaint or reassignment, yet the evidence was clear. Someone had complained about Marcus's behavior, building management had taken swift action, and Marcus was now working in the basement while someone else cleaned the executive floors. The facts were indisputable, even if Marcus couldn't understand the reasoning behind them, scission, or proving that the original complaint was baseless. If Marcus was stuck in a basement assignment because of David's interference, Alex would find a way to offer Marcus better opportunities outside the building entirely. The challenge was making contact with Marcus without creating additional problems or putting Marcus in an awkward position with his supervisors. Alex couldn't simply show up in the parking garage and start a conversation without raising questions about his motives and potentially triggering additional complaints. What Marcus didn't know was that his reassignment had triggered a series of conversations among the building's veteran employees that would eventually reach far beyond Nexus Tower. Marcus wasn't the only former service member working in the building, and his sudden demotion hadn't gone unnoticed by others who understood the specific challenges that veterans faced in civilian employment. Jim Patterson, Marcus's supervisor in the basement, was himself a Vietnam veteran who'd spent 40 years working blue-collar jobs after his military service. Jim had watched dozens of younger veterans cycle through various positions in the building, usually starting with hope and ambition before gradually accepting that their military experience counted for little in the civilian job market. Jim had been struck by Marcus's work ethic and attention to detail, qualities that spoke to someone who'd been trained to higher standards than typical janitorial work required. When Jim learned that Marcus had been reassigned from the executive floors due to a tenant complaint, his immediate reaction was skepticism. Jim had seen enough workplace politics to recognize when someone was being railroaded for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual performance. More importantly, Jim was connected to a network of veteran employees throughout Seattle's business district. These connections had developed organically over the years, as former service members gravitated toward each other for the mutual understanding and support that civilian colleagues rarely provided. The network included security guards, maintenance workers, food service employees, and others who worked in support roles for major corporations. When Jim mentioned Marcus's situation during one of the informal gatherings where veteran employees shared information about job opportunities and workplace issues, the response was immediate and concerned. Several members of the group had experienced similar situations where their attempts to engage professionally with executives or managers had been misinterpreted or punished. The pattern was troubling and familiar. Veterans who tried to contribute beyond their assigned roles were often seen as overstepping boundaries or challenging hierarchies. Their military training to identify problems and propose solutions was frequently interpreted as insubordination or inappropriate ambition. Their direct communication style, developed in environments where clarity could mean the difference between life and death, was often perceived as aggressive or confrontational in civilian workplaces. But the veteran network also included some success stories, former service members who'd managed to transition into professional roles despite institutional barriers. One of these was Elena Vasquez, a former Army logistics officer who now worked as a project coordinator for a major construction company. Elena had heard about Alex Chen's reputation in the Seattle business community and was intrigued by the idea that he might be genuinely interested in veteran talent. Elena decided to do some research on Alex's background and business practices. What she discovered was encouraging. Stellar Dynamics had a small but growing veteran employee base, and the company's hiring practices seemed more flexible than most tech firms. Alex himself had publicly spoken about the value of diverse perspectives in problem-solving, though he hadn't specifically focused on veteran recruitment. More intriguingly, Elena learned that Alex had been asking questions about veteran employment issues in various business forums, suggesting that his interest in the topic extended beyond any single encounter with Marcus. The timing of these inquiries, which had begun shortly after Marcus's reassignment, suggested that Alex might be developing broader initiatives rather than simply forgetting about their conversation. Elena shared this information with Jim Patterson, who passed it along to Marcus during one of their brief interactions in the basement mechanical rooms. Marcus's reaction was skeptical, but not entirely dismissive. The possibility that Alex's interest had been genuine, rather than the polite condescension Marcus had assumed, was both hopeful and painful to consider. If Alex really had been interested in Marcus's military experience and potential civilian applications, then Marcus's reassignment represented not just personal disappointment, but also a missed opportunity for meaningful work that could have utilized his actual skills. The basement assignment felt even more wasteful when viewed through that lens. But Marcus had learned to be cautious about hope, especially hope based on second-hand information that might be motivated by well-meaning but unrealistic optimism. Even if Alex's interest had been genuine, the practical reality was that Marcus was now assigned to work that kept him isolated from any professional opportunities. His military experience remained irrelevant to his daily tasks, and his prospects for advancement or recognition remained virtually non-existent. The conversation with Jim did plant a seed of curiosity, though. Marcus began paying attention to news about Stellar Dynamics and Alex Chen's business activities. He started reading about veteran employment issues more broadly, trying to understand whether his experiences were typical or exceptional. What Marcus discovered was both validating and discouraging. His struggles with civilian employment were shared by thousands of other veterans who possessed valuable skills but couldn't find employers willing to look beyond their lack of traditional civilian credentials. The statistics were stark. Veteran unemployment rates consistently exceeded civilian averages, and many former service members were significantly underemployed relative to their experience and capabilities. But Marcus also learned about innovative companies and organizations that were developing new approaches to veteran recruitment and integration. Some employers were beginning to recognize that military experience provided unique value in areas like logistics, project management, crisis response, and team leadership. The challenge was translating military accomplishments into language that civilian hiring managers could understand and value. Reading about these developments made Marcus feel both hopeful and frustrated. The recognition he'd been seeking did exist, but it remained rare and difficult to access. Most employers still relied on traditional hiring criteria that automatically excluded candidates with non-traditional backgrounds, regardless of their actual capabilities. Marcus began to understand that his situation wasn't just about personal failure or bad luck. It was about systemic problems in how civilian society evaluated and utilized military experience. The skills he'd developed overseas were genuinely valuable, but the systems for recognizing and applying those skills in civilian contexts were inadequate or non-existent. This realization was both liberating and overwhelming. On one hand, it confirmed that Marcus's sense of being undervalued wasn't delusional or self-serving. His military experience really did represent capabilities that could benefit civilian employers, even if those employers hadn't figured out how to identify or utilize such capabilities. On the other hand, understanding the systemic nature of the problem made individual solutions seem even more difficult to achieve. Marcus could improve his resume, develop new skills, and perfect his interview techniques, but he couldn't single-handedly change institutional biases that affected thousands of other veterans. The knowledge motivated Marcus to start thinking more strategically about his situation. Instead of simply accepting his current circumstances as permanent, he began exploring what it might take to create opportunities that better matched his actual capabilities. The basement assignment was temporary employment, not a life sentence, and Marcus started considering what steps he might take to move toward work that utilized rather than wasted his experience. The first step was acknowledging that he possessed valuable skills, even if current systems failed to recognize them. Marcus had managed complex logistics operations under extreme pressure, had led teams through life-threatening situations, had solved problems that required creativity and resourcefulness. These weren't just military experiences, they were demonstrations of capabilities that applied across multiple industries and contexts. The second step was understanding that finding the right opportunities might require unconventional approaches. Traditional job applications and hiring processes were clearly not designed for people with backgrounds like his. If Marcus wanted to find work that matched his capabilities, he might need to explore alternative pathways that bypassed conventional recruitment systems. Marcus began researching veteran-owned businesses, organizations that specialized in veteran placement, and companies that had developed innovative approaches to non-traditional hiring. He also started attending veteran networking events, something he'd avoided in the past because they often felt like professional pity parties rather than genuine opportunity building. What Marcus found at these events surprised him. Rather than defeated job seekers commiserating about their struggles, he encountered veterans who were actively working to create solutions for employment challenges. Some had started their own businesses, others had developed consulting practices, and many were collaborating on initiatives to change how civilian employers thought about military experience. The energy at these gatherings was markedly different from the isolation Marcus had been experiencing in the basement of Nexus Tower. These were people who refused to accept that their military service had been preparation for nothing more than low-wage labor. They were actively working to demonstrate the civilian value of their experience, both for themselves and for other veterans who would follow. Marcus began to see his current situation differently. The basement assignment was still frustrating and wasteful, but it was also temporary. The real question wasn't whether he deserved better opportunities, but how he could position himself to access those opportunities when they became available. This shift in perspective motivated Marcus to start preparing more systematically for whatever came next. He began documenting his military experience in terms that emphasized transferable skills rather than just describing duties and responsibilities. He started learning about industries where logistics expertise was particularly valuable, and he began developing a clearer understanding of how his problem-solving experience could apply to civilian contexts. Most importantly, Marcus stopped thinking of himself as a failed civilian and started thinking of himself as someone whose valuable experience hadn't yet found the right application. The distinction might seem subtle, but it fundamentally changed how Marcus approached his daily work and long-term planning. The basement assignment remained mindless and isolating, but Marcus now viewed it as temporary employment that provided income, while he developed strategies for finding work that better matched his capabilities. Instead of accepting invisibility as permanent, he started preparing for visibility on his own terms. This preparation would prove crucial when opportunities finally emerged, though Marcus had no way of knowing that those opportunities were already being developed by someone who hadn't forgotten their conversation and was working to create pathways for veterans like him to access meaningful work. The basement of Nexus Tower had become Marcus's temporary refuge from a world that didn't value his experience, but it was also becoming his launching point for a future that would finally recognize what he had to offer. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after Marcus had been reassigned to the basement. He almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was another generic job posting or veteran outreach program that would lead nowhere. The sender's address was unfamiliar, veteransstelladynamics.com, with the subject line, Logistics Excellence, Initiative, Invitation to Participate. Marcus had received dozens of similar messages over the years, most of them leading to dead ends or programs that promised more than they delivered. but something about the professional formatting and specific mention of logistics caught his attention. He opened the email during his lunch break, sitting in the basement break room that smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and fluorescent lighting. "Dear Mr. Rodriguez," the email began, "Stellar Dynamics is launching an innovative program to identify and develop logistics talent with military backgrounds. Your experience managing complex supply chain operations in challenging environments has been brought to our attention through our Veteran Network Outreach Initiative. We would like to invite you to participate in a pilot program designed to translate military logistics expertise into civilian applications." Marcus read the paragraph 3 times, trying to process what seemed too good to be true. Someone had specifically identified his logistics experience and considered it valuable enough to warrant a personal invitation. The email went on to describe a 6-month program that would combine skills assessment, civilian business training, and hands-on project work with actual companies facing logistics challenges. Participants will work directly with Seattle area businesses to solve real supply chain problems while developing the civilian credentials and professional networks necessary for career advancement. The program includes full salary support, professional development resources, and guaranteed job placement assistance upon successful completion. The email was signed by Elena Vasquez, Program Director, with Alex Chen listed as the initiative's founder and primary sponsor. Marcus stared at Alex's name, feeling a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't immediately sort through. The man, who'd shown brief interest in Marcus's background before disappearing from his life, was now apparently offering a comprehensive program designed exactly for people in Marcus's situation. Marcus's first instinct was suspicion. 6 months had passed without any contact from Alex or anyone else at Stellar Dynamics. Why now? Was this legitimate opportunity or some kind of corporate public relations initiative that would use veterans as marketing material without providing real benefits? Marcus had learned to be skeptical of programs that promised dramatic career changes, especially when they seemed too perfectly aligned with his specific needs and background. But the email included detailed information about the program structure, specific examples of participating companies, and testimonials from other veterans who'd been involved in the pilot phase. The level of detail and specificity suggested serious planning and real resource commitment rather than superficial gestures toward veteran hiring. Marcus researched Stellar Dynamics more thoroughly than he ever had before, looking for information about the company's actual hiring practices, employee satisfaction, and corporate culture. What he found was encouraging. The company had a reputation for innovative problem-solving, treating employees well, and maintaining the kind of collaborative environment that might actually value diverse perspectives. More importantly, Marcus discovered that Alex Chen had been publicly advocating for veteran employment initiatives for months, speaking at business conferences and writing articles about the untapped potential of military experience in civilian contexts. This wasn't a recent development or a reaction to publicity pressure. It appeared to be a sustained commitment that had been developing over time. The application process for the logistics program was more thorough than Marcus had expected. Rather than simply submitting a resume and hoping for the best, applicants were required to complete detailed assessments of their military experience, provide specific examples of logistical challenges they'd solved, and participate in interviews that focused on problem-solving methodology rather than traditional civilian credentials. Marcus spent a week preparing his application, documenting his military logistics experience in ways that emphasized transferable skills and practical results. He described the Afghanistan supply chain optimization project in detail, breaking down the problem-solving process he'd used and quantifying the improvements his solutions had achieved. The interview process was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. In civilian job searches, instead of questions about his education or traditional work history, the interviewers focused on specific scenarios and asked Marcus to walk through how he would approach complex logistics problems. They seemed genuinely interested in his thinking process and military experience, rather than trying to fit him into predetermined categories. Elena Vasquez conducted the final interview, and Marcus was impressed by her understanding of both military, logistics, and civilian business applications. She asked detailed questions about Marcus's Afghanistan experience, but she also helped him articulate how those experiences translated to civilian contexts in ways that Marcus had never fully considered. The military taught you to optimize resource allocation under extreme constraints, Elena explained. That's exactly what civilian companies need when they're trying to reduce costs while maintaining service quality. Your experience managing supply chains in combat zones is directly relevant to managing supply chains in competitive business environments. The conversation felt like the recognition Marcus had been seeking for years. Elena understood both the complexity of military, logistics, and the value of that experience in civilian applications. She didn't see Marcus's military background as something to overcome or work around. She saw it as a competitive advantage that civilian employers should be eager to access. Marcus was accepted into the program 2 weeks later, along with 11 of the veterans from various military backgrounds and logistics specialties. The cohort included former Navy supply officers, Army transportation specialists, Air Force logistics coordinators, and Marines with experience in forward deployment operations. All had struggled with civilian employment despite possessing sophisticated expertise in complex problem-solving. The program officially launched in April, housed in a dedicated facility near downtown Seattle that had been specifically designed for hands-on logistics training. The space included simulated warehouse operations, computer labs with industry-standard supply chain software, and conference rooms where participants could work with actual business clients on real logistics challenges. Alex Chen addressed the group during the opening session, and Marcus was struck by how different he seemed from the exhausted executive Marcus had encountered in the Nexus Tower hallway. Alex spoke passionately about the wasted potential he saw in veteran underemployment and the business opportunities that companies were missing by failing to recognize military expertise. This program exists because traditional hiring systems are fundamentally broken when it comes to evaluating non-traditional experience, Alex said. Companies need the kind of innovative thinking that military logistics requires, but they don't know how to identify or access that thinking through conventional recruitment methods. Alex made eye contact with Marcus during his remarks, a brief acknowledgement that carried weight Marcus couldn't fully interpret. Was it recognition of their previous conversation? Apology for what had happened afterward? Simple professional courtesy? Marcus couldn't tell, but the moment suggested that their earlier encounter hadn't been forgotten or dismissed. The program's structure was more rigorous and comprehensive than Marcus had anticipated. Participants spent mornings in classroom settings learning civilian business terminology, industry standards, and professional communication styles. Afternoons were devoted to hands-on project work with local companies that had volunteered to serve as training partners. Marcus was assigned to work with a regional food distribution company that was struggling with inventory management and delivery optimization. The company's existing logistics system was inefficient and costly, with frequent stockouts of popular items and excess inventory of slow-moving products. Delivery routes were poorly planned, resulting in unnecessary fuel costs and delayed shipments. The problems were complex but familiar to Marcus, who recognized similar inefficiencies to those he'd addressed in military supply chains. The civilian context was different, but the underlying challenges of resource optimization, demand forecasting, and process improvement were essentially the same as what he'd dealt with in Afghanistan. Working with the food distribution company gave Marcus the opportunity to apply his military experience to civilian problems while learning industry-specific knowledge and business terminology. The company's management team was initially skeptical about working with military personnel who lacked civilian logistics experience, but their attitudes changed quickly as Marcus identified problems and proposed solutions that their existing staff had overlooked. Marcus's analysis revealed that the company's inventory problems stemmed from outdated forecasting methods that failed to account for seasonal demand patterns and regional preferences. His delivery optimization recommendations could reduce fuel costs by 30%, while improving customer satisfaction through more reliable scheduling. The company implemented Marcus's recommendations on a trial basis and saw immediate improvements in both efficiency and profitability. More importantly for Marcus, the success demonstrated that his military experience had direct civilian applications that could provide measurable business value. The validation was both professional and personal. For the first time since leaving the military, Marcus felt like his expertise was being recognized and utilized rather than dismissed or ignored. The complex problem-solving skills he'd developed overseas were finally finding appropriate civilian applications, and the results were both visible and appreciated. Other participants in the program were having similar experiences with their assigned companies. The Navy supply officer was helping a manufacturing firm optimize their procurement processes. The Army transportation specialist was redesigning distribution networks for a retail chain. The Air Force logistics coordinator was developing inventory management systems for a healthcare organization. All were discovering that their military experience had prepared them for challenges that civilian logistics professionals often struggled to address. The military's emphasis on efficiency, resourcefulness, and adaptability under pressure translated directly to competitive advantages in civilian business environments. As the program progressed, Marcus began to understand that Alex Chen's initiative was addressing problems much larger than individual veteran employment. The program was demonstrating that traditional hiring systems were systematically excluding valuable talent based on arbitrary criteria that had little relationship to actual job performance. The participating companies were benefiting significantly from access to military logistics expertise, but most admitted they would never have considered hiring veterans through conventional recruitment processes. The program was serving as a bridge between military talent and civilian opportunities that might never have connected otherwise. Marcus also began to appreciate the sophistication of the program's design. Rather than simply placing veterans in existing civilian roles, the initiative was creating new pathways that allowed military experience to be recognized and valued on its own terms. Participants weren't just learning to fit into civilian categories. They were demonstrating the unique value they could provide to civilian organizations. The success of the pilot program attracted attention from other companies and organizations interested in accessing military talent. Word spread through Seattle's business community about the innovative logistics solutions that program participants were developing, and demand for their services began to exceed the program's capacity to provide them. By the program's midpoint, several participants had received job offers from companies they'd worked with during their training. Marcus was approached by multiple organizations interested in hiring him as a logistics consultant or operations manager. The recognition he'd been seeking for years was finally materializing, but in ways he'd never anticipated. The transformation wasn't just professional, but personal. Marcus found himself regaining confidence in his abilities and value that had been eroded by years of rejection and underemployment. The program had provided not just skills, training, and job placement assistance, but validation that his military experience represented genuine expertise worthy of respect and compensation. Looking back on his months in the basement of Nexus Tower, Marcus could see how those experiences had been preparation for the opportunities that were now emerging. The isolation and frustration had motivated him to think more strategically about his situation and prepare for possibilities he couldn't have imagined at the time. The wrong door he'd knocked on had indeed changed everything, though not in the immediate way he'd hoped. The conversation with Alex Chen had planted seeds that took months to germinate, but the eventual harvest was far more substantial than Marcus could have dreamed when he was pushing a mop cart through empty hallways. 2 years after that conversation in the hallway, Marcus stood in the main conference room of Stellar Dynamics, looking out at an audience of Seattle business leaders who had gathered to hear about the Logistics Excellence Initiative's remarkable success. He wore a tailored suit that fit him properly, carried himself with the confidence of someone whose expertise was recognized and valued, and spoke about supply chain optimization with the authority of someone who had transformed both military and civilian logistics operations. The program had exceeded everyone's expectations. What began as a pilot initiative with 12 veterans had grown into a comprehensive program that had placed over 200 former service members in meaningful logistics and operations roles throughout the Pacific Northwest. The participants weren't just finding jobs, they were revolutionizing how their employers approached complex operational challenges. Marcus had become the program's most visible success story, though he was uncomfortable with the attention that designation brought. After completing the 6-month training program, he'd been hired by the regional food distribution company where he'd done his practicum work. Within a year, he'd been promoted to Director of Operations, overseeing supply chain optimization for a network of facilities across 3 states. The transformation of the food distribution company under Marcus's leadership had become a case study that other businesses wanted to replicate. His military-developed approach to logistics had reduced the company's operational costs by 40% while improving delivery reliability and customer satisfaction. The success had attracted attention from industry publications and business schools interested in understanding how military logistics expertise could be applied to civilian operations. But Marcus knew that his individual success was just one example of the broader transformation that Alex Chen's initiative had created. The other veterans in his cohort had achieved similar breakthroughs in their respective industries. The Navy supply officer had become a procurement specialist for a major manufacturing firm, where her expertise in resource allocation under constraints had revolutionized their supplier relationships. The Army transportation specialist was now managing distribution networks for a retail chain that had expanded into new markets based on the efficiencies his innovations had created. The program had demonstrated that veteran underemployment wasn't just a social problem, but an economic inefficiency that cost businesses access to valuable talent. Companies that participated in the initiative consistently reported improvements in operational efficiency, cost reduction, and problem-solving capabilities that exceeded what they achieved through traditional hiring processes. Alex Chen had documented these results meticulously, building a comprehensive case for veteran hiring that was based on measurable business benefits rather than charitable obligations. His research had caught the attention of national business organizations and government agencies interested in scaling successful veteran employment initiatives. Standing at the podium in the Stellar Dynamics conference room, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from the basement of Nexus Tower to his current role as a recognized expert in logistics optimization. The path hadn't been linear or predictable, but it had ultimately led to exactly the kind of meaningful work he'd been seeking since leaving the military. 2 years ago, Marcus began his presentation. I was working as a janitor in this building, convinced that my military experience was irrelevant to civilian employment. I'd been rejected from dozens of positions because I lacked the right college degree or civilian credentials. I thought my logistics expertise was worthless outside the military context where I'd developed it. The audience included CEOs, operations, managers and human resources directors from companies throughout the region. Many had attended because they were struggling with logistics challenges and were curious about unconventional solutions. Others were there because they'd heard about the remarkable results that companies were achieving by hiring program graduates. What I learned through this program, Marcus continued, is that the problem wasn't my qualifications or capabilities. The problem was a hiring system that couldn't recognize the value of non-traditional experience. Military logistics isn't fundamentally different from civilian logistics. The principles of resource optimization, demand forecasting, and process improvement are the same, regardless of context. Marcus clicked to a slide showing the food distribution company's performance metrics before and after implementing his recommendations. The improvements were dramatic and undeniable: reduced costs, improved efficiency, increased customer satisfaction, and expanded market reach. The data told a story that was impossible to dismiss or attribute to coincidence. These results weren't achieved through complex new technologies or massive capital investments, Marcus explained. They came from applying military problem-solving methodologies to civilian operational challenges. The military teaches you to optimize performance under resource constraints, which is exactly what businesses need in competitive markets. The presentation included testimonials from other program graduates and their employers, each describing similar transformations in operational performance and business results. The pattern was consistent across industries and company sizes. Military logistics expertise provided competitive advantages that civilian hiring processes had been systematically overlooking. Alex Chen watched from the back of the room, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional success. The initiative had achieved its intended goals of connecting veteran talent with civilian opportunities, but it had also demonstrated broader principles about the value of diverse perspectives and the limitations of traditional hiring practices. The program's success had led to expansion opportunities that Alex hadn't anticipated when he'd started the initiative. Several major corporations had requested customized versions of the training program for their own veteran hiring efforts. Government agencies were interested in scaling the model nationally. Business schools wanted to incorporate the curriculum into their supply chain management programs. But for Alex, the most meaningful aspect of the program's success was the individual transformations he'd witnessed in participants like Marcus. The confident professional speaking to the business leaders bore little resemblance to the defeated janitor Alex had encountered in the hallway 2 years earlier. The change wasn't just about job placement or career advancement. It was about recognition of human potential that had been systematically ignored by institutional biases. During the question and answer session following Marcus's presentation, a CEO from a major shipping company asked about the scalability of the program's approach. "This sounds promising for individual companies," he said, "but can this model really address veteran unemployment at a meaningful scale?" Marcus's response reflected the broader vision that the program had developed over time. "The goal isn't just to help individual veterans find better jobs," he explained. "The goal is to change how civilian employers think about military experience and how they evaluate potential in general. We're proving that talent exists in forms that traditional hiring systems don't recognize." Alex stepped forward to add context to Marcus's response. "The Logistics Excellence Initiative is just one example of what becomes possible when we look beyond conventional credentials to identify actual capabilities. We're planning similar programs for project management, cybersecurity, crisis response, and other areas where military experience provides unique advantages. The expansion plans were ambitious and reflected Alex's growing understanding of the systemic nature of the problems the program was addressing. Veteran underemployment was just one manifestation of broader inefficiencies in how society identified and utilized human potential. The principles that made the logistics program successful could be applied to other populations whose talents were overlooked by traditional hiring systems. After the presentation, Marcus found himself surrounded by business leaders interested in learning more about his approach to logistics optimization. Several offered consulting opportunities or suggested collaboration on industry-wide initiatives. The recognition felt surreal to someone who'd spent years being invisible to the same business community that now sought his expertise. Alex approached Marcus as the crowd began to disperse, and they stepped onto the building's terrace overlooking Seattle's skyline. The city spread out below them, thousands of lights representing businesses and organizations that could benefit from the kind of innovative thinking the program was developing. "I owe you an apology," Alex said without preamble. "I never filed a complaint about our conversation that morning. I was looking forward to our lunch meeting, and when you didn't show up, I assumed you'd changed your mind. I should have investigated what happened instead of just accepting that you weren't interested." Marcus had suspected as much based on his research into the program's development, but hearing Alex confirm, it still provided a sense of closure. "I figured that out eventually," Marcus replied. "The timeline didn't make sense if you'd been the one to complain, but it took me a while to get past feeling like I'd been naive about the whole interaction." "You weren't naive," Alex said firmly. "You were honest about your situation and your capabilities. The system failed you, not the other way around. That's what this program is really about. Creating pathways that recognize talent regardless of how it's packaged." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them from that early morning encounter to the successful program they'd built together. The wrong door had indeed led to the right opportunities, but only through persistence, resources, and commitment that most people in Marcus's situation wouldn't have access to. "What's next?" Marcus asked. "For the program? For Stellar Dynamics? For veteran employment in general?" Alex's response reflected the ambitious vision that the program's success had made possible. "We're launching similar initiatives in 12 other cities with federal funding and corporate partnerships that will reach thousands of veterans. We're also developing programs for other populations whose talents are systematically overlooked. People with disabilities, older workers, individuals with non-traditional educational backgrounds." The conversation was interrupted by Elena Vasquez, who approached with a tablet displaying real-time registration numbers for the program's next cohort. "We're already oversubscribed for the fall session," she reported, "and we've got companies from 6 states requesting customized training programs." The demand represented both opportunity and challenge. The program's success had created more interest than its current capacity could accommodate, requiring careful planning for sustainable expansion. But it also validated the fundamental premise that had motivated Alex's initial investment. There was enormous, untapped potential in populations that traditional hiring systems routinely overlooked. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself thinking about the other veterans still working in invisible roles throughout the city, people with valuable experience who hadn't yet found pathways to meaningful recognition. The program could help hundreds or even thousands of individuals, But millions of veterans nationwide face similar challenges in translating their military experience to civilian opportunities. The scope of the problem remained daunting, but the success of the Logistics Excellence Initiative had demonstrated that systematic solutions were possible. Individual success stories like Marcus's were meaningful, but the real impact would come from changing institutional practices and cultural attitudes that prevented society from accessing the full range of available talent. Driving home through Seattle's streets, Marcus passed the Nexus Tower where his transformation had begun with a simple mistake in navigation. The building looked the same from the outside, but Marcus's relationship to it had changed completely. He was no longer the invisible janitor pushing a cart through empty hallways. He was a recognized expert whose opinions were sought by business leaders and whose innovations were improving operational efficiency across multiple industries. The basement where he'd spent months feeling forgotten and undervalued was now just a memory, but it was a memory that informed his ongoing commitment to helping other veterans find their own pathways to recognition and meaningful work. The isolation and frustration of that period had been necessary preparation for the opportunities that followed, teaching him resilience and strategic thinking that served him well in his current role. Most importantly, Marcus's journey had demonstrated that individual transformation was possible even within systems that seemed designed to prevent it. The wrong door had led to the right conversation, which had led to the right program, which had led to the right opportunities. But none of it would have happened without the willingness to be vulnerable, to trust in unexpected kindness, and to persist through setbacks that felt permanent but turned out to be temporary. The story that had begun with tears of frustration in a corporate hallway had become a model for systemic change that was helping thousands of people find recognition for talents that society had been systematically wasting. Sometimes the most profound transformations really did begin with the simplest mistakes, when the right people were paying attention and had the resources to turn recognition into opportunity. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from another program graduate who'd just been promoted to regional operations manager at a logistics company in Portland. The success was spreading, creating networks of recognition and opportunity that extended far beyond any single program or initiative. The wrong door had opened not just individual possibilities, but institutional changes that would benefit people. Marcus would never meet in companies he'd never heard of. That was the real measure of transformation, when individual success becomes systematic change that creates opportunities for others facing similar challenges. Marcus's journey from janitor to logistics director was meaningful, but the program that made such journeys possible for others was the true legacy of that conversation in a corporate hallway on a quiet Thursday morning. Marcus Rodriguez stood in his corner office at Pacific Northwest Logistics Solutions, the company he'd founded just 1 year after completing the Stellar Dynamics program. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the Seattle skyline stretching toward the horizon, including the Nexus Tower, where his transformation had begun with a single wrong turn down a corporate hallway. The morning news was playing on his office television, featuring a segment about veteran unemployment that made his chest tighten with familiar frustration. The statistics hadn't changed much. Hundreds of thousands of former service members struggling to find meaningful work, their military experience dismissed as irrelevant by civilian employers who couldn't see past traditional credentials to recognize exceptional capabilities. But Marcus also knew something the news anchors didn't mention. Change was happening, one conversation at a time, one program at a time, one company at a time. The Logistics Excellence Initiative had now graduated over 800 veterans, placing them in meaningful roles across the country. Similar programs were launching in other industries, creating pathways for military talent that traditional hiring systems had been blind to for decades. Marcus's phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Interview with Sarah Chen, 2 p.m. Sarah was the daughter of Alex Chen and a documentary filmmaker interested in telling the story of how a wrong door had sparked a movement that was transforming veteran employment across multiple industries. The interview would be part of a larger project about invisible talent and systemic change. As Marcus prepared his thoughts for the conversation, he reflected on how much had changed since that early morning encounter 3 years ago. His company now employed 47 people, including 23 veterans who'd found their way to meaningful work through various programs inspired by Alex's original initiative. The business was thriving, but more importantly, it was proving that veteran-owned companies could compete at the highest levels when given appropriate opportunities and recognition. The real measure of success, though, wasn't his personal achievements, or even his company's growth. It was the ripple effect that continued to spread through communities and industries as more people recognized the untapped potential that existed in populations traditional hiring systems routinely overlooked. Marcus thought about the janitor who'd cleaned his office the night before, a recent immigrant with engineering credentials from his home country that weren't recognized in the United States. He thought about the security guard in his building, who mentioned having management experience from the retail industry but couldn't find employers willing to look beyond her current role. He thought about the thousands of people working invisible jobs while possessing capabilities their employers never bothered to discover. The Logistics Excellence Initiative had solved one piece of a much larger puzzle, demonstrating that talent existed in forms that institutional systems weren't designed to recognize. But the broader challenge remained. How do you create a society that actively seeks out and develops human potential wherever it exists, rather than relying on narrow criteria that exclude more people than they include? When Sarah Chen arrived for the interview, Marcus was struck by her resemblance to her father, not just physically, but in the way she approached complex questions with genuine curiosity and attention to nuance. She'd clearly inherited Alex's ability to see patterns and possibilities that others missed. "Tell me about that morning when you knocked on the wrong door," Sarah began. "What was going through your mind in the moments before everything changed?" Marcus smiled, remembering the exhaustion and desperation that had defined his life at that time. "I was thinking about numbers," he said. "Bills I couldn't pay, rent increases I couldn't afford, the growing certainty that I'd never find work that matched my capabilities. I was invisible to the world around me, and I'd started to believe that maybe I deserved to be invisible. But you knocked anyway. I knocked anyway. And your father answered, which changed everything. But here's what I want people to understand. There are thousands of wrong doors being knocked on every day by people with extraordinary potential who just need someone to ask the right questions and really listen to the answers." Sarah leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the broader implications of Marcus's story. The documentary is called The Right-Wrong Door, and we're exploring how systematic change can begin with individual moments of recognition. What would you tell someone who's in the position you were in 3 years ago? Marcus considered the question carefully, thinking about all the veterans and other overlooked individuals who were still working invisible jobs while possessing capabilities that could transform entire industries if properly recognized and developed. "I'd tell them that their current circumstances don't define their potential," he said finally. "The systems that evaluate worth and capability are flawed, not the people those systems reject. Your military experience, your unconventional background, your non-traditional path, these aren't limitations to overcome. They're advantages that the right people will recognize as exactly what they've been looking for." But how do you find those right people? Sometimes you don't find them. Sometimes they find you, if you're willing to be authentic about who you are and what you've experienced. The conversation with your father happened because I was honest about my struggles instead of pretending everything was fine. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the beginning of genuine connection. As the interview continued, Marcus found himself thinking about the viewers who would eventually see Sarah's documentary. Some would be veterans struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. Others would be business leaders wondering if their companies were missing opportunities by relying on traditional hiring practices. Many would be people working jobs that didn't reflect their capabilities, wondering if meaningful recognition was possible. There's something I want to say directly to anyone watching this who feels invisible in their current situation, Marcus said, looking directly into the camera. Your story isn't over. The skills you've developed, the challenges you've overcome, the unique perspective you bring to problems, these have value even if current systems don't recognize it. The wrong door you're afraid to knock on might be exactly the right door for reasons you can't imagine. Sarah asked about the practical steps that people could take to create their own opportunities for recognition and advancement. Marcus's response drew from both his personal experience and his observations of hundreds of other veterans who'd successfully transitioned to meaningful civilian careers. First, document your experience in terms that emphasize transferable skills rather than just military duties, he advised. Second, research industries and companies that face challenges your background has prepared you to address. Third, network with other veterans who've made successful transitions. They understand the challenges and can provide guidance that civilian career counselors often can't. But most importantly, Marcus continued, don't wait for permission to demonstrate your value. Look for opportunities to solve problems, contribute ideas, and show rather than just tell people what you're capable of. The military taught us to take initiative and find solutions. Use those instincts in civilian contexts, even when traditional career advice suggests staying in your lane. As the interview concluded, Sarah asked Marcus about his hopes for the future of veteran employment and the broader movement toward recognizing unconventional talent. His response reflected both optimism and realism about the work that remained to be done. I hope that in 10 years, stories like mine won't be remarkable because they'll be commonplace, Marcus said. I hope we'll have created systems that actively seek out and develop potential wherever it exists, rather than relying on narrow criteria that exclude extraordinary people for arbitrary reasons. After Sarah left, Marcus stood at his office windows, watching the sunset paint Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the city below, there were people working invisible jobs while possessing capabilities that could change industries if properly recognized. There were veterans struggling with transitions that seemed impossible but weren't. There were business leaders missing opportunities to access exceptional talent because they didn't know how to look beyond traditional credentials. The wrong door he'd knocked on 3 years ago had opened not just individual opportunities, but systematic changes that were still rippling through communities and industries. The conversation with Alex Chen had planted seeds that had grown into programs, companies, and initiatives that were transforming how society thought about talent, potential, and worth, but the work was far from finished. Every day brought new opportunities to recognize potential in unexpected places, to ask questions that revealed capabilities hiding beneath surface appearances, to create pathways for people whose talents traditional systems routinely overlooked. If you've been inspired by Marcus's journey from invisible janitor to recognized business leader, there's something important you can do right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because we're committed to sharing more stories about people who've transformed their lives by refusing to accept that their current circumstances defined their potential. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their unconventional background isn't a limitation, but an advantage waiting for the right recognition. Comment below about your own experiences with invisible work or unexpected opportunities. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to knock on their own wrong door. The most powerful changes in our world begin with individual moments of recognition and connection. Marcus knocked on the wrong door and found the right opportunity. Alex answered with curiosity instead of dismissal and created pathways for thousands of others. Each of us has the power to be either the person knocking or the person answering, to seek recognition or to provide. Your wrong door is waiting. Your right conversation is possible. Your transformation is closer than you think. The only question is whether you'll have the courage to knock, and whether the rest of us will have the wisdom to answer with the kind of attention that can change everything. Subscribe now, and let's build a world where everyone's potential gets recognized, where no talent goes to waste, and where the right opportunities find the right people, regardless of how unconventional their paths might be. The story continues with each person who refuses to remain invisible, and each person who chooses to really see the extraordinary potential that exists all around us.